crazy.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I think I'm going to borrow this for just a second. So, welcome. You guys made it. It's the end. Yay! So you get to go back to the office or back to the other fun stuff that you're doing, so that's great. So just looking at the calendar real quickly, or the schedule for today, we've got grid transformation for an hour. That will be with Cristin. Then you've got me for an hour doing project management. Try not to go to sleep. There'll be a break, right? And then Kate Breen, hit the ground running. Anybody here met Kate? Yeah, high energy, get ready, it's going to happen. So, and then there'll be a cooling down period with Brad and closing remarks. Okay, so that's the way the morning is going to go. Now, to get on to grid transformation, I want to introduce Cristin Lyons, one of our partners at Scott Madden. This is really special because you've got the industry expert in grid transformation, probably done more work in that space than almost anybody else. So listen intently for the next hour because this is a really important part of the energy business. All right? So, Cristin, come on.
Okay. Well, you may have overstated the case, but thank you, Steve. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be here. Just so you all know, I've never done this training before. We stood up the grid transformation practice almost 2 years ago. And just to start off, do you all even know what grid transformation is? So we've got nods. I'm counting on Ryan here to say, yes, absolutely, I get it. Or not. No, Ryan did a little bit of work for me in this area earlier this year. So we stood up this practice in August of 2015. And the thinking behind it is that the grid is transforming to accommodate new resources and ways to manage the load side of the equation. And what started to happen is that our clients are asking a lot of questions about this. We have a tremendous number of regulatory proceedings related to how do you begin to integrate these alternative resources into the grid. And it just made sense for us to stand up a practice. I got chosen for it because I've been working in T&D almost the entire time I've been with Scott Madden. So it was kind of my clients that were at the forefront of a lot of this stuff. So that's how we started talking about grid transformation. In 2013, there was an article published, and the name escapes me, but it came out of EEI, and what it started talking about was the detrimental effects that we were going to start to see for the traditional utility business thanks to alternative resources showing up on the customer side of the meter. So 2013, we came out of the recession a few years earlier. We're seeing declining demand growth. And we've got customers starting to put self-generation, rooftop solar on their homes. Energy efficiency is getting more and more interesting. Demand response is getting more and more interesting. And in 2013, we started hearing words like, these assets are a mortal threat to the utility business model. We're going to see a utility death spiral. I mean, really strong language out of very prominent leaders in the industry. At least one of those has lost his job since, which puts a little bit of that in perspective. He was the head of NRG. But we started to hear a tremendous amount about, holy cow, what is this stuff going to do to the way utilities operate? So what I'm hoping to do today is talk a little bit about how Scott Madden sees these resources, what we think it actually means, because I would say that we are far from a utility death spiral, and that language has calmed down tremendously in the last few years. And I'll talk a little bit about work that we're doing in this area so you all get a taste of kind of how do we fit into this larger equation. Make sense? Any questions or comments before we jump in? Okay. So the words utility of the future, grid transformation, utility business model changes, all of that is encompassed in what I'm about to talk about. So hopefully I'll give you the underpinnings of why we're having such major discussions about this. Some of this is going to be a redux from what Stu talked to you about, which is important, and I'll share why. So, if you ask me what grid transformation and utility of the future is all about, you talk about distributed energy resources. So this is stuff that can typically be deployed behind the customer meter, which means that utilities often can't see it. It may be aggregated, and it may be load modifying or it may be self-generation. So you've got energy efficiency, which has been a part of our resource mix for many, many years. You have demand response, which has become more and more sophisticated over time. You have distributed generation, and we've actually had distributed generation on the grid for a long time in the form of combined heat and power units. So industrial customers figured out a long time ago that sometimes it's more efficient to self-generate. So it's not a new concept. What's new is that the customers that are deploying this kind of stuff are smaller and smaller, and residential customers matter a lot in this discussion. We've got storage, battery storage, and battery storage is showing up on the transmission side of the equation, and it's showing up behind the meter. The Tesla battery is the best example, but everyone describes storage today as a game changer, and you're going to hear a lot about that. We've done a fair bit of work in storage as well, and I think Chris V probably talked to you about storage too. It fits in this definition here. And microgrids. And microgrids can be anything from a small residential development to an entire university campus. They got a tremendous amount of play in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, because there's a picture where part of an NYU campus remained lit while the rest of Manhattan was black. So microgrids all of a sudden became all the rage in New York and New England. At least from my perspective, that's died down a little bit. The economics on microgrids are hard, but it continues to be in the mix. So that when you ask me what DER are, this is the list. And I suspect over time that's going to shift around as well as new technologies come online. All of these impact every major function of an electric utility. And that's where we're working, with all of these major functions and how this stuff shows up. Okay? So we're going to go back to the why this matters for a second in terms of the traditional utility model. So for many years, and I know Stu covered this with you all in great detail, we had big central station generation plants carried by and the power was carried by high voltage transmission lines to transformers, and then that was basically distributed to your customers through the distribution system. And power flowed one way. And it was very predictable. Your system planning process really focused on our basically the highest peak day, which in most utilities, at least in this part of the country, is a summer day. Say, okay, we will plan to have enough generation, transmission, and distribution to meet the hottest day on the system, because our tools for managing that down are very limited. So no matter what, we have to keep the lights on, and we're going to make sure we have enough generation and transmission and distribution to keep everybody's lights on under those conditions. And we're going to plan the system so if our two worst things that could happen on the system, say you have a major transmission failure and you lose a nuclear plant, we're even going to be able to keep the lights on under those two contingencies. No matter what, we will keep the lights on. So very reliable, a lot of excess capacity built into the existing system, but generally speaking, meant to keep the lights on under all circumstances. And if you think about the reliability of the electric grid, it's pretty much done that. You know, it's not that as we look at these alternative resources, we're trying to fix a system that's broken. This system is over 99.99% reliable across the US and North America. But it's expensive. You know, if you think about all that generation, you know, there's a tremendous amount of baseload generation that runs all the time, but as you move up the stack to meet those peak days, there's a lot of generation that doesn't get used all the time. So the question becomes, okay, how do we begin to change the way that works? And you've got two sources of change as we think about distributed energy resources. The first is, what if we have mini power plants that feed customers so they don't have to contribute to that peak load question? So you start to reduce your peak load through what I would call load modification. You've got generation on the customer side. You've got energy efficiency and demand response now. So energy efficiency reduces the baseline. Demand response can reduce your peaks. So all of a sudden, the two givens that you had in the system, that customer load would always be there and could not be changed, all of a sudden that's a question mark. And the fact that we have to build enough generation to always meet that peak also becomes a question mark, because now we can manage the peak. So all of the underpinnings of the way we've planned and built the system are shifting. So, and I know this again is a redux of some of what Stu talked to you about. So in the old model, you have central station generation, long-haul transmission, distribution system. The utility was required to provide electric service. It has an obligation to serve everybody. And what it gets in return is a rate of return, an ROE on its rate base, in essence, pass-through of O&M expenses, and it has an obligation to serve. It gets monopoly status as well. So it's a pretty good gig if you're the only one who can supply power. Well, all of a sudden, because of the changing technologies and resources we're showing up, many of the things that underpin this rate-making model that has been in place for 100 years come into question. So what if people self-supply? Does the utility continue to have a legal obligation to serve that customer? What if under this schema, and we're starting to see this happen, certain customers are more expensive to serve than others? Does everybody still pay the same? So again, and we'll come back to those questions, but monopoly status, if you think about microgrids, what does that do to the utility monopoly status for that particular service territory? And the utility has counted on those revenues as part of this rate-making construct. So when we talk about how the utility business model is being changed, this is what we're talking about. And depending upon what state you live in, it's being challenged in very different ways. Any thoughts or questions there before I move on? Hopefully some of this is sounding somewhat familiar from when you saw Stu's presentation. Yes?
Are there particular regions in the United States that are pursuing this more aggressively than others? And if so, do they have anything in common?
Absolutely. So, as I'm sure you all have heard, California has seen a tremendous influx of distributed energy resources. So, from a resource perspective, California has been forced to deal with the issues that we're talking about. And they've actually had a lot of operational challenges because of the way DER show up on the system. There are other states that have decided to take a very proactive regulatory stance, New York being one of them. And we've been working in New York for the last couple of years on these issues. New York doesn't have the penetration of DER anywhere close to, and I'll show you some numbers, to where like Hawaii or California are. But the regulator has said, you know what, we're going to build the construct so that they come to New York. We're seeing a lot of different approaches, and we've written a couple of white papers on this particular topic. So if you're interested, there's stuff out there. Other questions, thoughts? So, you will see every consultant that is working in this space has some picture like this. This one happens to be from The Economist and ABB, and again, I think it was one that you saw with Stu. But the big message here, and we are a long way from having all of these resources integrated all over the grid. I'm going to show you some numbers in a minute. But in essence, what we're seeing is that the grid is being asked to do things that it never had to do before. And what that means for our customers, our clients, is that they're having to build out the grid in a way that they've never had to before. So you think about electricity running from transmission to distribution transformers and then out to the customer. Well, at the end of the day, you put some flavor of generation in there, and all of a sudden you have what they call backfeed, or electricity running in the wrong direction, because the system wasn't built to accommodate that. So that means that you've got relays that have to be either upgraded or reset. You have transformers that have to be upgraded or protected in a different way, because again, the power's flowing in places that nobody expected. We also have traditionally not paid nearly as much attention from a monitoring and control perspective to the assets beyond the big transformers and transmission. So over the last probably 15 years, we've seen the SCADA control, so system control and data acquisition. It's basically all of the points on the transmission system that a control room operator needs to see and monitor. And so, okay, is something overloading? Are we seeing, voltage irregularities? All of that is controlled and monitored in one place. Well, now the need to control and monitor assets is creeping further and further and further into the distribution system. So utilities are saying, okay, how do I get visibility into this stuff that's showing up? How do I know if I'm going to have backfeed? Because once upon a time, I couldn't even see that I had an asset there. So again, all of this means that there's a lot of utility CapEx that's going into upgrading systems to start to manage all of these different pieces. So we've talked about what's happening. Does anybody know how many megawatts of nameplate capacity generation there are on the US system today? Did Stu tell you that? Nobody took that down as a note? Any guesses? So a typical nuclear generation station, what, 1,500 megawatts? So across the US, any guesses? How many all in?
How many nuclear stations?
Now, how many megawatts of nameplate capacity we have out there? How about in the state of Georgia? I actually don't know that answer, but any thoughts, Steve?
It's going to be like 30 gigawatts.
Okay, so 30,000 megawatts in Georgia. I think that's high, but so to put it in perspective, the peak load of the Con Edison service territory is about 14,000 megawatts. So across the country, there is roughly 1 million megawatts of nameplate capacity out there. And nameplate means that's how much it is capable of. That doesn't mean how much it ran. So, and I tell you that because I want to put in perspective the numbers that are on this slide. So as we talk about DER, California is leading the pack. And the net metered stuff, that's the rooftop solar in essence. The green and the orange, net metered or net metered by third party, which can be aggregated. So those two are really what's kind of challenging the grid and challenging the regulatory model. The grid synchronized and CNI standby is the stuff that we've had out there for a long time. So in California, which is leading the pack, aside from Hawaii, in real numbers, 5,500 megawatts on their system. So remember, nameplate capacity for the US, 1 million. 5,500 is challenging the system in California. So I tell you that because there are two things going on here. There are places where, because of the size of these systems or because of the concentration of DER, like in California and Hawaii, you're seeing system effects that may far outpace the size or the proportion of generation that this is actually taking up. But the other piece is everybody is scared to death about this stuff coming because of the impacts to the utility business model. So in places like Illinois, for instance, very low penetrations. I don't even think, Illinois didn't even, oh, here we go, 137 installed megawatts. I mean, that's nothing. And you notice it's mostly CNI standby. So, yeah, go ahead.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit about what you mentioned the need to upgrade?
Mm-hmm.
What does backfeed actually cause? Like, what are they like? Is it like a disastrous complete shutdown, or is it just things degrading faster?
So it depends on the system. So, and I can give you an example on the Con Edison system. So they have what they call network protectors throughout the grid that when power flows the wrong way, these network protectors open to protect the transformer, because the transformer is typically the most valuable part of your system. So you do put in place a lot of relaying and internal communications to make sure that if you have voltage excursions or overloads, the breakers open and those assets are protected. So in Con Edison's system, as they started to see distributed generation come online, those network protectors were set so that if power flowed toward that transformer in a way that was not predicted, the switches would open. So they would isolate that transformer, but at the same time take a whole section of the grid out of service. So now they're having to reset those or put in new infrastructure to enable fault detection in a different way. Make sense? So as I was saying here, you've got Illinois, which has minimal distributed energy resources, but they've undertaken tremendous efforts to upgrade their grid and get ready for a distributed energy future. And they've just kicked off a regulatory proceeding to do just that. So the response is not necessarily commensurate with what they've seen to date. Steve? I thought I saw a hand.
No, it's important to realize this is such a challenge because utilities historically, like Cristin said, have been blind past the big substations. What went on the lines that feed your house or even this building, they didn't have a clue except for the meter that they read once a month. They didn't know how hot that line was, how it was being utilized. They were clueless about it. And this small amount of generation that we're putting out at the ends is drawing all that ignorance into high relief because we're going to overload feeders, we're going to blow up pole-mounted transformers. There's nothing equipped to deal with understanding what's happened in that last mile, so to speak.
Yep.
So it's a big deal for the industry.
Yes?
The utilities own that last mile distribution. They just had no impetus for knowing what was going on before.
Yeah.
And so how many of you have had a power outage in the last 5 years? Did you have to call your utility to tell them you were out of service? In some jurisdictions today, you still have to call your utility to tell them because they can't see when you're out.
So, funny story. Years ago, I worked for a utility that was introducing a new product. It was a system that you could install in your cabin in the woods that would call you, the owner, when the power went out, in case you needed to run up there and save whatever in your fridge. They actually launched this product. One of the first consumer responses was, "That's a neat idea. Why don't you have it call you?"
Yeah. Many utilities to this day cannot see when their customers are out of service. So, and that's one of the big impetuses for AMI. Any other thoughts here, questions? I feel like one's being formulated in the corner, I can't tell.
I was just wondering, like, within the different types of utility companies, like, for some co-ops, for some vertically integrated ones, do you see, like, a certain type of utility company having more problems with this than the others?
It's a good question. It's very much a state-by-state question. So a few other things are playing in as either, I would call them motivating forces or demotivating forces, for lack of a better way of putting that. And I'll use Texas as an example. So Texas is a completely deregulated state. It means that the transmission and distribution is completely separated from the wholesale markets, and they are very focused on it being a pure wholesale market, which in many ways is good. You get least cost generation that way. It's caused them a few issues, but be that as it may. They have no net metering standard for those for what were formerly vertically integrated utilities, and they've basically said, look, if you guys can make the behind-the-meter stuff work, knock yourselves out. And the retail energy service providers, if you want to do it, you know, the regulator really kept a hands-off approach. There are parts of Texas that were not deregulated, and that's the munis and co-ops there. So what you've seen is a divergence of activities related to DER because the incentives are completely different. So if you own just the wires company, you're getting an infrastructure charge on that, and somebody else is responsible for the commodity. Until that makes sense on a commodity basis, you're not going to offer that to your customers, right? But for the vertically integrateds, and CPS Energy is a perfect example, and they're a big client of a couple of our partners. They have been very proactive because their customers have come to them and said, look, we want this stuff, and we want you to figure out a way to make it work. So they've got net metering, which the rest of Texas doesn't, except in other munis and co-ops. They've got a program whereby a customer that cannot put rooftop solar on their house can actually buy into kind of a community solar arrangement that's arranged as a PPA to CPS. So they've taken all these steps around integrating this stuff because they're thinking there's the customer need and desire, and they can make money on it. So, and again, state by state, some states are deregulated, but they still have net metering. It's a mixed bag of incentives as you go across the country. Yeah.
So like in California, that's kind of a better utilization of the energy. Is that kind of what we're talking about here? Or is it just being more aware of the excess energy not being used?
So what this chart shows only is the amount of distributed energy resource nameplate capacity that's out there. So if the green and the orange are how much in total is rooftop solar, so that's behind the meter generation there. In terms of, is it a better use of energy, I think that remains a big question, and you're actually pointing to something that's very important in the industry right now. So not only does California have a lot of rooftop solar, they have a lot of utility scale, which begs the question, which is more cost effective?
You also have to realize energy markets are all regional. They're very specific region, or even state-based. So the West Coast is blessed with enormous hydro resources, and they have a terrible natural gas pipeline system as well as terminal system. So you start putting those factors together, and they're going to naturally move toward a different energy mix than, say, Texas would, or New York for that matter. So one size fits all doesn't work in this market. You have to look at it regionally and state by state in terms of what makes sense in that region.
Very much so. But the ongoing debate, like, is distributed energy resource, are they more cost effective versus utility scale? I would put my money on utility scale right now. But there are other things in play. Customers like the control that this gives them. They like the ability to see the reduction to their bill under net metering. Well, net metering's going away. Most states have some initiative to do away with net metering as it now stands, so you don't make as much money on it. Okay, does that mean they're going to go with more kind of green programs procured by the utility? Maybe. There's been a tremendous amount of marketing by some very sophisticated marketers like Solar City on this side of the equation. In my mind, the jury's still out as to whether that business model is going to be sustainable over time. Other thoughts or questions? Okay. So this gives you a sense of DG, and that's the rooftop solar and some of those commercial, as a percentage of the nameplate capacity within the state. So this is getting back to the point. In California, it's almost 7% of their nameplate capacity, but in other states, it drops precipitously. Florida, 1.5. Hawaii, 22. And we're seeing a lot of challenges in Hawaii in managing this. North Carolina comes in at a 1.3. Okay. So wanted to dive a little bit more into what this means if you're the utility that has all this stuff. So we talked a little bit about this before. Typically, and as we go back, I'll take you back 15 years and we'll move forward from there. So 15 years ago, transmission was really where you had all of your monitoring and control, all your big, valuable assets. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've migrated that down. The grid has gotten smarter. You talk about the smart grid technologies. Well, it's basically making the distribution system do what transmission's been able to do for many years. So automatic reclosing, the automatic fault sensing, taking stuff offline when it's not working properly, all of that's been part of the way we operate transmission forever. And now distribution is capable of the same. Now you're asking it to do different stuff because of the reverse power feeds we talked about. So you may have certain feeders in distribution where all of a sudden you have all of this generation that's coming from the other direction. You have to upgrade. You have to upgrade switches. You have to upgrade transformers. So it's not cheap. We also don't always know where this stuff is going to show up because customers, they put in an interconnection request to the utility a year out. I don't know where they're going to want to connect. I have no idea. So a lot of money is being spent both on the technology that's out in the field and on the ability to see this stuff. So you've got distribution management systems, you've got outage management systems, you've got UMS. I can't remember what UMS was. Who knows? But a lot of sensors, and you're seeing a lot of technology companies basically sell their wares on this front. AMI has been in the mix for many years. AMI makes all things related to distributed energy resources easier because you can now see what's happening at the customer side of the meter. And then the customer can respond to a lot of different types of programs. They can respond if you make a call for demand response, for instance. The customer can respond. Yep.
So what's the first step then? Would you want to do like the smart meters at the point of each customer to determine really what switches and capacitors need upgrading on your system, or How do utilities typically work that?
I don't think there's a typical at this point. Right now, AMI penetration in the U.S. is about 50%, so we have a long way to go on just being able to see what happens at the customer premise. Your larger C&I type customers typically have that kind of metering already. That's standard. As you look at the way different companies are choosing to upgrade, it is very heavily dependent on what their regulator lets them do. For instance, we're doing a lot of work in New York, as I mentioned. New York has put a huge focus on getting distributed energy resources out there. They don't have AMI yet. So, like Con Edison just launched a program, $1.5 billion in the city, to install AMI. Well, they're doing that concurrently with changing all this regulatory, all the regulatory and internal utility processes to accommodate more DER, but the DER aren't there yet. If you look at California, California was fully deployed in AMI years ago. So that's made that, in essence, what they've done is they've kind of taken the infrastructure building block, focused there first, and now they're adding the regulatory and incentive type changes on top of that. The state of Illinois just underwent a huge infrastructure program where they did both. They had a lot of distribution automation and technology upgrades in addition to AMI. So we're actually about to publish a paper about the fact that when DER arrive, which we expect them to shortly because of new incentives that have been rolled out, the system's ready. You know, and in my opinion, that is probably the right way to go. But it's all over the map. Okay, so from a system operations perspective, this stuff makes people nervous, is the long and short of it. California, of course, has been right at the center of this because they started seeing things like, if the fog rolled in, all of a sudden the generation that they counted on from rooftop solar wasn't there. You know, and it seems elementary, but they had to figure it out seeing it live.
Quick question.
Yes.
Are these upgrades getting baked into a rate case then and passed on?
Yeah, in some cases, like in New York for Con Ed's AMI program, that was a separate proceeding in addition to their rate case. So that was kind of treated as an additional item. In California, I think all of that stuff has gone through the general rate case. And when California asked their utilities to file distribution resource plans, and what those plans did was say, this is what we think is needed to upgrade the system to accommodate all this stuff, and here's the dollar amount that we expect to file in the rate case. New York is being much less straightforward about what the projected costs are.
Are utilities having any trouble communicating that out? Because I can imagine if you have high demand for a rooftop, customers are wanting to produce their own power and may not understand the full extent of what that really looks like on the other end.
Well, and you're getting at something that's an important part of the question. So net metering, if you get net metered, if you get the paid back, in essence, at your full retail rate, you don't care because it all comes off your bill. If you're only getting paid back for the wholesale portion, then you're still paying for the distribution and transmission infrastructure as part of that transaction. So you're going to care. And depending upon the commission, they may or may not want customers to have that much visibility into what they're paying to do this kind of work. So it's a mixed bag, and again, it's state by state. So as I mentioned before, when we used to plan the system, we looked at peak day, put in a little bit of contingency, made sure we could operate under all circumstances, and called it a day. Well, now we're seeing transmission and distribution planned differently. So on the distribution side, what's happening is that we're having to look at, okay, where do we think DER might show up? How do we incorporate the DER that are already out there into forecasting? So for instance, in California, if I think my peak load is going to be 1,000 megawatts, but when that peak is projected to take place, I know that I'm going to have a bunch of rooftop solar on, and I can now rely on demand response. My entire forecasting process is different, both at the system level and at the region level. So again, we're having to employ very different tools to approach all of this. How does all of this, if I'm used to planning my system to peak load, that means the transmission and generation infrastructure that I used to rely on having to build, it all looks completely different as you roll up those forecasts. And many companies are struggling with this idea of like, okay, are we sure that demand response is going to show up? So now we have a multivariate set of problems, right? Because we've got just changes to the entire generation mix. So generation is changing. Obviously, I know you all have talked about the changing resource mix from nuclear and coal moving to gas-fired. That looks different. We add distributed resources there. And now your load is not steady anymore. And there's a lot of talk in the industry right now about the idea of we can plan the load to match the generation that's coming on. And storage is actually the holy grail in that conversation. So maybe I used to plan for 1,000 megawatt peak. Now I'm only going to plan for 500 because I can trust that all these other resources will be there. And that is a complete shift in the way we think about this stuff. And we're not there yet. You know, this is very much an ongoing discussion.
So in the old world, we had to plan for like 24 sources of generation maybe in a region. And now we're talking about planning for thousands.
Yep.
And each of the thousands have very different profiles in terms of how much energy they can put out moment to moment and how long they can do it.
So planning is getting more and more complex as we go. The good news on these is that if you look at the amount of DER that's out there today, we still have runway. You know, we've got some time to figure this stuff out, but the more this stuff progresses, the more utilities are going to have to grapple with all of these questions. So I mentioned system planning is getting more and more interesting. Where is this stuff going to show up? When? And I no longer, you know, when you interconnect, for instance, a coal plant or even a wind farm, big utility scale assets, you've got years to plan them and build the interconnections. This stuff in the distribution system, you can have it on a couple of weeks. Completely different world. Who operates what, where, when, and how. Another twist in the operations piece is that we're now starting to see your wholesale markets look to third parties to actually aggregate these resources. So what I mean by that is in California there's it's not a proposal anymore, it's actually a tariff where a third party called a scheduling coordinator can bid into the wholesale market and they can say, you know what, I will give you this amount of capacity for this period. And they proceed to aggregate all of the distributed generation and other DERs to meet that capacity need. So you've got another group in the mix doing resource planning and operating those assets. So your ISO is going, okay, well we can count on the scheduling coordinator for this, we've got the utility for this, we've got the merchant generation plan here, we're going to be buying from Utah here. The level of complexity is continuing to increase. So we haven't talked about the customer. So how many of you all have rooftop solar on your houses? How many know someone who has rooftop solar on their house? Okay, a handful. Why?
Why do they have?
Why do they have it, or why not? Have you made a decision not to or to?
My family in California has it solely for the purpose of heating and cooling.
So it's,
Only hooked up to that system.
that's a good friend of mine in California too.
Interesting. So 2 in California.
Half and half with, because he wants to do it. He and his wife think it's the right thing to do. But they're looking at the business case to see if it works for their family.
Others?
A lot of people in China have solar panels on their rooftop for
Mhm.
hot water.
So sounds like hot water and pools are a big driver. Okay.
We have in Colorado, they were running a bunch of payback, essentially, the cost to you and the pool here for the solar panels.
Sweet. So one of the things that's happening is that there's a tremendous amount of discussion about what our customers want. And I'll talk about two schools of thought. It's obviously a much more complex conversation than that. There's one school of thought, and the former CEO of Duke used to talk about this a lot, is customers do not care. They want the lights to come on, and that's it. They want it to be a completely passive, reliable transaction with the utility company. Pay your bill, your lights are there, full stop. There's another school of thought, and I would say that's on the other end of the spectrum, that is customers want to engage with their energy usage. They want to know how expensive it is. They want to be able to reduce their peak demand. They want to conserve, whether it's for environmental reasons or for cost savings reasons. So there are entirely different views on what our customers actually want. I would say that a lot of this is a generational question. You know, and I'll use myself and my husband as an example. I actually, until I looked it up on our utility bill about 2 weeks ago, I didn't even know how much we were paying or how much we used. And I've been in this industry for like 18 years. Because I don't care. I fall into that group of I want the lights to come on. I don't think that we're representative, particularly of the younger generations, because people are becoming more environmentally conscious. I think I didn't grow up with the ability to manage everything on an app, and you all have. And I think there's an appeal as it pertains to energy usage of that, of being able to say, okay, I can see what's going on in my house. Oh, geez, prices are really high. You know, I don't think you're going to turn off your fridge, but maybe something else. So this is an ongoing discussion, and I think there are regulatory proceedings that are premised on the idea that your customers are going to show up and be actively engaged. That is very much the view of New York that's saying, and the way I describe New York is if we build it, they will come. I actually don't believe that based on what's happening. And a lot of this has to do with how expensive your utility bills are. You know, ours are cheap down here in the South. You were going to say something?
I was just wondering, with the introduction of like more competition in the energy market, do you see like companies are moving away from like, they're trying to segment the two different customers, and that's saying like those who just will pay a bill and they don't care what it is, and then for those that are like, you know, like they want to particularly measure and control their energy needs and usage? Do you see companies moving towards like that diversion of a engagement plan with customers?
Utilities are notoriously unsophisticated when it comes to dealing with their customers. In fact, only recently they started calling them customers. Until then, y'all were ratepayers. That's actually not a joke. And regulatory proceedings to this day describe customers as ratepayers or load. It's true. So the idea of a divergent strategy to address different customer needs, I think, would absolutely benefit the industry, because utilities, again, it's how do you flex to this new model and respond? I think it would be brilliant. And you're starting to see some segmentation for rooftop solar customers and different products that may show up. Steve?
What they can't square yet is the traditional regulatory model of we have to serve everybody, we have to charge the same prices to everybody. But how do I accommodate these people who want these very different services, especially when they're 5% of the market, 7%, they're not even 10% of the customer base. Small percentage in a lot of cases, but they want me to spend all this money on my system and have other people pay for it. Socialize all that stuff in the rate base because it's good for us as an economy, says the 5%, while the 95% are saying, no, I just want to flip the switch and have the light come on. That's the conundrum that both the commissions and our utilities are in right now and trying to figure out how to solve that.
So I did some research on Power, which I don't even know. When I did the research, they were burning through cash in nobody's business.
They got acquired by Oracle.
Okay. So are companies like that coming in and like, I mean, I know they're offering that service, kind of like you said, to individuals, and I think they have to, I don't know, like pay something additional on their bill to have that control, but there are companies that I think are doing a little bit of that. So.
Well, and I think O-Power has made a very interesting niche for themselves. Is everybody familiar with O-Power? Basically what they do is they can tell you what your usage looks like against everybody in your neighborhood. So it becomes a bit of a competition, right? As I understand what they're trying to do is that they've sold that product to utilities. and are providing data analytics behind it to start to drive some of the behavior. So I think that product in and of itself is brilliant. The data analytics and the ability to analyze customer behavior will absolutely continue. I think where the rubber meets the road is if you try to offer these different products at different price points with different service levels, where do you bump up against the issue that Steve mentioned in the rate and regulatory construct? Okay. So the customer, I think this is going to be an evolving discussion. There's a lot focused on this in the industry in terms of technologies, things you can do in your house, the rest of it. How that all migrates back up to what the utility is going to do with it remains to be seen. So back to, again, our initial conundrum. We've got declining demand growth, and in some case, real decline in demand. Utilities are, so what that means is, in essence, you have to charge more per kilowatt hour to make the same money that you've made in previous years. Even if you're decoupled, your rates are going to go up. So in this world, how does the utility make money? Do you offer different tariffs for rooftop solar customers? Do you provide different tariffs for storage? Do you aggregate all these behind-the-meter resources yourself and offer it as a service? And in some cases, utilities are going back to what they talked about in the 90s. When I first joined the industry, they were talking about, okay, can we get into HVAC systems? Can we provide engineering services to C&I customers? Can we do gas appliances? So all these ideas that people had, 25 years ago are coming back, which I find fascinating. So this remains a question, and it's completely tied to the way utilities have traditionally made money and the fact that that's going away. So it's no wonder that we've heard about the death spiral and people being quite nervous. So this gets to your question, how do you price the products that are on offer? And what are customers willing to pay? We have no idea about this today. I'm going to talk for a second about stakeholders. So once upon a time when we were all just ratepayers, your utility filed a rate case. The commission ruled on it, and sometimes some parties would intervene and say, you know what, they're charging too much for that, or we want more services for this. But it was basically a bilateral negotiation between the utility and the Public Service Commission, Public Utilities Commission. That is no longer the case. So when we talk about stakeholder engagement and these processes to change the regulatory model, everyone and their brother is showing up right now, and the commissions are encouraging all of these parties to have a say. So in New York, you have a stakeholder process that incorporates everyone from a tiny solar developer to a utility with $14 billion in revenues every year, to Solar City, to a storage provider. It is, everybody gets an equal seat at the table, which is making these proceedings exceedingly challenging. There's a proceeding going on in Minnesota where they've come out with some interesting documents. It's not being driven by the PSC, it's being driven by an external stakeholder group. And these parties are kind of having their say in what's published. When we had a conversation with one of the big utilities in Minnesota, they basically said, you know what, we're not on board with this stuff. It's being published by a group of which we're a part, but right at the front it says we did not gain consensus on these views. And they're debating whether they stay in the process at all. So there are a number of interests, and there are consulting groups that are in the middle of this as well. It is not necessarily good for the customer, it's not necessarily good for the utility, who are typically our clients, but there is a tremendous amount of noise. So our role, I think, is to help our clients sort out, what's good in this, and how do you respond to what's not, which is no mean feat. Everybody has, self-interest is a tremendous player. What are the rules, and how and when will they change? And that is directly tied in most jurisdictions to what's going on in the stakeholder process. So we've called a number of these into question. So when we talk about obligation to serve, your utility cannot turn you off if you're paying your bill. So you go to self-supply, you join up with the microgrid in your town, and you say, you know what, we don't need the utility anymore. We're going to pull up the drawbridge, self-supply, call it a day. 5 years later, this hasn't worked out so well. Reliability has suffered. I want to come back. What happens? The utility has not built the infrastructure or managed the infrastructure to take care of you as a customer. So now they have to pay to do that, and you go back to your regular old rate? Who is ultimately responsible for the reliability of the grid when you have all these parties out there? So one of the things that's happening is, I mentioned that the system that we have today is expensive and it has a lot of excess capacity in it. So one of the theories that's out there right now is that if you use a combination of demand response and rooftop solar and storage, and you aggregate those resources, you can actually offset the need for upgrading a substation, for instance. Okay, in theory, that sounds awesome. So the utility continues to be responsible to the Public Utility Commission for reliability and for keeping your lights on. But now it's a third party that has to show up with demand response, storage, and rooftop solar. What happens when those things fail? Who sets the rules for the standard that they must meet in order to participate as a member of the grid? And does the utility continue to solely hold the bag for reliability? You know, and to my knowledge, that question has not been fully addressed anywhere. And utilities continue to be concerned, so they have very high standards for what you can put on the grid, as they should. You know, if their job is to keep the lights on, that's as it should be. The universal service, so if DER, so what we're starting to see is this idea that as a DER can contribute to the reliability of the grid, or can even just provide electricity back to the grid, people are saying, okay, we need to find a way to value that resource on the grid, same way we value generation. But it has different values depending upon where it's located. So if it's located in a load-constrained area, a load pocket, okay, that'll have higher value than if it's located somewhere else. How do you value that stuff? And there are proceedings in 3 jurisdictions that I'm aware of that are trying to tackle this. And it is exceedingly difficult because it means modeling the distribution system that we haven't modeled to date. It means saying that, you know what, rooftop solar on your house is more valuable than it is over there. So how does that square with what we pay on a per kilowatt hour basis, customer by customer? So there are a lot of things that are going to come to fruition here. Are we actually deploying least cost solutions? So again, as the utility mandate, least cost planning. How do you put the best cost resources on the grid to manage reliability? That's really not in the discussion right now. And we're spending a tremendous amount of money for these resources. And what should or should not be socialized? You know, should everybody pay because this neighborhood wants to have a microgrid or have all this rooftop solar where we need distribution upgrades? And then many of these are arguments that we have been having in transmission for 15, 20 years. You know, this whole idea of who pays for those types of benefits. It has been core in transmission. I think we've made a lot of progress there. Now, again, it's all migrating down to the lower voltages, which just makes it harder. We talked about the franchise territory. And lastly, is the utility a monopoly anymore? You know, I would suggest that based on the penetration of DER today, yes. The answer is yes. And I think the wires business may always be. Generation's not. So as we think about the complexity associated with bringing these on, it's a good thing we have a long runway in most states, because these are really, really hard questions. And it's why there is so much energy about this today. You know, I describe DER as kind of the bright, shiny object in the industry right now. There's good reason for that. So I mentioned the many cooks may spoil the soup in terms of the stakeholder engagement. This is my view of all the people that are in the mix and driving some of the discussion. You've got vendors that are going to customers and promising all kinds of stuff. You've got vendors going to the utilities and promising all kinds of stuff. And then they're going to the regulators and saying, you know what? Guess what we can do? Make the utility do it. So that's all part of that process. Customers are paying attention to a degree that they haven't to the utility business. And granted, it's a small percentage of customers, but it's changing. Legislators are showing up and they're saying all this has to be clean by 2030, 2050. Take your pick. The regulators are setting the model, making the rules, they're picking technologies, and they're picking winners. And then the utilities are attempting to keep the lights on while managing all this other stuff. So, back to what grid transformation does. We have expertise to help our clients transform the way they operate, plan, maintain the grid, and interact with their customers. And that's what we're doing in this part of the business. So we're helping our clients figure out how to do distribution planning in a different way. We're helping them make regulatory filings as the commissions ask for these, stretch goals, we'll say. We're helping in, the interconnection process. How do DG developers interconnect, and what does that mean inside a utility for the way they get things done? So it's an interesting part of the business right now. It's also extraordinarily competitive. It's the bright, shiny object in the room, and all of our competitors are very focused on this too. So we get questions from time to time about how grid transformation and clean tech work together. So Chris V and I coordinate the vast majority of stuff we do in terms of client facing and in terms of the collateral that we develop. But if you asked us, the stuff in gray is where clean tech and sustainability really leads from an intellectual property development type perspective. And the stuff in blue is where grid transformation does. A lot of overlap. We're touching a lot of the same parts of our clients, but that's how we've chosen to divide it up. All right? And I don't know. Any other questions or comments? Great. Well, thanks for your attention. We appreciate it.